here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of a photographer who I spoke to very recently, Gered Mankowitz, to find out more about life, love, poetry and all that other groovy stuff. Also has had a book recently published titled The Rolling Stones, Rare and Unseen, which has a lot of amazing photographs and also various chapters by different writers, including Keith Richards and various other interesting folks. So anyway, this is the interview. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years.
Yes, I was born a long time before you, but well, I don't know. Probably that whole period in the sort of late-ish 50s, Cliff Richard, and in particular, a record called Diana by Paul Anka, which I think was my the first single I ever bought when I was about 12, I think. And I don't know what drew me to it. I've listened to it quite regularly since. And it's one of those curious things, but it attracted me at the time. And, but I've never been a sort of, you talk about Bowie being such a strong influence on you. I don't remember anybody really until the Rolling Stones being such a major influence. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones, I think, probably were the two bands that got me most interested in popular music. And then I very rapidly moved into soul, R&B, Tamla, and that sort of thing, and blues, and that sort of stayed with me.
Yes, absolutely. Because you were born just after the war, so obviously that was quite a quite interesting period. I think you were born 1 year old before David Bowie and Lemmy from Motorhead. I think they were born in 1947. So, what were your parents? Were they from London at this stage and had lived through the Blitz?
Yeah. So yes, my both my mother and father were from London. My father was from the East End. My mother was from a somewhat more salubrious sort of St. John's Wood area of London. They met at Cambridge University and they got married in London in 1945. And then I came along just over a year later. Obviously, I don't really have any strong recollections of that post-war period. We were pretty poor. My dad was struggling. They were working as hard as they could. They had a lot of support from their parents, both sets of parents. And I don't really, my earliest memories are probably from the very early 50s and of my grandparents. They had a shop over on East Ham Railway Bridge overlooking the railway. My grandfather had a stall in East Ham Market. My grandmother ran the shop where they sold, any jewellery, silver, that sort of thing. And they had this sort of fire escape type metal landing, and I used to be put there in my pram chair watching the railways. And I have quite a strong memory of that, waving at the engine drivers and them tooting their whistle at me, and that whole sort of landscape of railways and steam and noise. And it's always had a sort of romantic effect on me.
Well, I'm not surprised. That kind of scene, I think it was, both. There's been a lot of iconic films in the 50s and 60s with people on railway lines with that sort of blanket of smoke and sort of moody figures. And obviously It's a Wonderful Life has that sort of sound of the railways, and the character of James Stewart always wanting to leave small town America for something else, but never quite happening. So it's quite a romantic kind of idea, actually. But your dad was also a writer, wasn't he? He was a screenwriter, and obviously having a Cambridge background as well with your mum, you must have mixed in slightly different circles with sort of a bohemian, educated kind of neighbourhood and community.
Yes, well, we did. I mean, my father really had a big breakthrough in the early 50s. Up until that point, he was really struggling, writing poetry, teaching, writing articles, doing whatever he could. And then he had a very famous book published called A Kid for Two Farthings, then another one called Make Me an Offer. And then he wrote a film called Bespoke Overcoat, or rather a play that was made into a film that won an Oscar in, I think, 1953 or 1954 as the best English language short or something like that, and became a name and became successful and was continued to be successful throughout the 60s and into the early 70s. And it was, it was quite an interesting background. I went to a sort of progressive co-educational school in Hampstead. I learnt very little, and I left when I was just 15 to go and serve an apprenticeship.
Right. So was the apprenticeship in photography and art at this stage?
It was in photography. It was at a place called Camera Press, which was a vast photo agency situated in Russell Square in London, in the sort of basement maze of a block of flats called, I think it was called Russell Court on Coram Street off Russell Square. And I served a shortish apprenticeship there, learning the ins and outs of commercial photography, really. Gave me a fantastic sort of grounding, a great sort of blueprint upon which to build my career.
Yes, and sort of what photographers had you seen, or what particular pictures had you possibly seen at this stage, as in your teenage years, the early teenage years, that sort of fascinated you towards such a career rather than something like your mother's background or your father's background?
Well, I wasn't entirely. I wanted to be an actor for a long time. I wanted to be an actor, and my father briefly owned a theatre in Swiss Cottage called the Embassy Theatre, and had a sort of repertory company there with some wonderful actors, including Miriam Carlin and Alfie Bass and David Kossoff, and lots of really good actors of their day. And I used to go with him to Saturday afternoon rehearsals and steal makeup from the dressing rooms and make myself up and dress up. And I loved the atmosphere of the theatre. I always thought I was going to be something in the theatre. And then when I was about 12 or 13, my dad was working with Peter Sellers, the actor and comedian, or the comic actor, or I don't know how you sum him up, really. And he came to Sunday lunch to discuss a project or to work with my dad on a project. And he was a very keen amateur photographer, and he brought with him a full Hasselblad camera kit and a large 5x4-inch Polaroid camera, which was very rare. We'd hardly seen them in the UK. And proceeded to take the most extraordinary pictures of myself and my brother where it appeared that my brother was standing in my hand, like Tom Thumb.
Right.
I think he'd been working on the movie Tom Thumb with Terry Thomas, so that was on his mind. And seeing this photograph materialize in whatever it was, 2 or 3 minutes, was absolutely amazing and captured my imagination and excited me. But then he showed me the Hasselblad. Now, in case your listeners don't know, Hasselblad is a Swedish manufacturer of medium format cameras, and they were considered by many people, and still are, to be the finest cameras ever made, in that format at least. And the camera consists of a lens, a body, and a magazine, all interchangeable. And so he started showing me this extraordinary piece of equipment, but he demonstrated it in a insane sort of Swedish chef goon show type voice. And I was in absolute tears of laughter. And I just loved it. And when he finally left, and I said to my dad, I want to be a photographer and I want to own a Hasselblad. And so that was the sort of turning point. I can't explain or tell you why I went from being an actor to wanting to be an actor to wanting to be a photographer, but maybe my father encouraged it, because he definitely would have not liked me to be an actor. And
Right.
And I don't think I had the talent anyway, but I think so my interest in photography was sort of encouraged. And when I reached that point where I could leave school, and Tom Blau, the owner of Camera Press, had generously offered me this apprenticeship, the family were very supportive. My mum and dad encouraged me to take it up.
Yes, my God, that's amazing. But there's quite a rapid moment here in your late teens, very early 60s. Because did you go to Amsterdam and then appear in Barbados at this stage?
Well,
Doing fashion photography. I mean, most of us at that point wouldn't even.
Yes, it wasn't quite like that. We roll back the Holland, the Amsterdam Holland trip was a school trip.
Right.
And by that moment, I think I was either 13 or just 14. By that moment, my interest in photography had been started by this meeting with Peter Sellers. And my grandmother had given me a camera called a Bensini Comet. And I'd taken that with me on this school holiday, and I'd taken some photographs of Delft Cathedral. And it was because of those photographs that I went to see, with my father, Tom Blau, who he knew, because Tom Blau had photographed us as a family for various magazines. And Tom Blau very sweetly and very generously bought one of my Delft pictures for the library, because apparently they didn't have any pictures of Delft Cathedral, whatever. He gave me a £5 for it. And I was absolutely overjoyed. And I thought that, wow, I can take photographs and earn money. Yippee, this is going to be fun.
Because a fiver in those days is probably a week's wages for a person in a factory, isn't it?
Well, perhaps not quite, but I mean, it was a lump of money, much more than I'd ever seen.
Yes,
before. And it was enough money to make you think that this photography business might be quite lucrative. But then my apprenticeship with Tom Blau at Camera Press was sort of cut short, because I always get slightly confused. I think we're talking about 1960, the end of 1960. My father, for reasons that are shrouded in mystery, decided to take the whole family to Barbados in the Caribbean to live there. And I was thought of as being much too young. I was only just 15 to be left behind. So I was taken to Barbados with the rest of the family, where the idea was that I would set up a darkroom once Dad had established us in a family home in Barbados. I would set up a darkroom and I would start taking photographs in Barbados. And that's sort of what happened, but it was a sort of quite a complicated and difficult period and an odd period because none of us really understood why he had done this. And there was a certain degree of not conflict, but uncertainty, a lack of settlement in going there. We were fish out of water really for a while, and it took us a while to settle.
Yes, well, it's a fascinating mystery, isn't it? Really, it's sort of all places. I mean, this isn't back in the late 50s and early 60s. Just a certain trip just would have seemed completely out of the question. And yes.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know. It was already quite well connected with the outside world. You know, BOAC, which is a sort of forerunner of British Airways, flew there via Bermuda. Not every week, not every day, but 2 or 3 times a week. So it was easy to get in and out of, and it was easy to get up to New York. So my father could continue his work. I think he wanted to get us out of Europe. I think for whatever reasons, and as I say, the sort of detail is shrouded in family mystery, but he got us out of Europe and into Barbados, and it was a great adventure. And I did start my professional career there, and I did quite a lot of photography there. I set up a darkroom, with very little real idea about it. I mean, I hadn't ever been a sort of amateur at-home photographer processing film in a little tank under the stairs sort of thing. My first experience of the darkroom was at Camera Press, which was a great, huge commercial darkroom turning out hundreds, if not thousands, of prints every day.
Yes, my God, this is fascinating, isn't it? And then, so 63, you're back in the UK, you set up your own studio, and this is, almost like the birth of modern pop rock that we know, because up to then, we'd obviously had Little Richard and Elvis Presley, and there's been jazz, there's been blues, there's been the world of, Cliff Richard and people like that as well. But, this was like the Beatles appearing, then the Stones, the Kinks, the Who, you were right there. So it wasn't like the music like that had particularly existed beforehand. So when you heard that the opening bars of some of their early songs, were you immediately captivated by it?
I was. I like the Stones. I heard the Beatles first, like most of us, I think. And I think one of the things that struck me, I used to listen to pop music on Radio Luxembourg. And I used to listen to it under the sheets at night because Radio Luxembourg was a station that only broadcast at night. And it wasn't a particularly strong signal. And you could only get it, if you were lucky in the evening. And they had some great DJs on it, and they played some fantastic music. And I never remember whether it was Please Please Me or Love Me Do, whichever was the first Beatles single. And I thought it was fantastic. I loved it. But I had absolutely no idea from hearing it what these people who were singing it were like. I had no idea how many of them were. I didn't know what color they were. I didn't know anything about them. I just heard the music. And I think that might have spurred a bit of a sort of subconscious urge to see what they looked like. And then I started seeing the Stones and thinking that I like the Stones more than I like the Beatles in terms of their image, because the Beatles seemed to be terribly conforming. They wore suits, they wore ties, they were very clean, they were very neat. They didn't strike me as being particularly exciting, although I loved their music and they were clearly enormously talented. But the Stones had an edginess to them. They had a dangerous element to them. They had a naughtiness to them, which I found very appealing. And once they dropped the uniform that they were first dressed up in, which I guess everybody thought a band had to have a uniform.
Yes.
They began to emerge as 5 very individual characters, and that I found very appealing.
Yes. So when was the first time you kind of photographed a band, either in sort of a studio setting or stage, and when was the first time you met the Stones?
I first photographed a pop band, a duo called Chad and Jeremy, who I'd met and were taking portraits of in their studio in 1963. And they were lovely chaps. I got on very well with them. And they said, oh, you know, we sing in a coffee bar just round the corner in Mayfair. Would you come and photograph us? Which I did. And then they got signed to a record company called Ember Records, a little independent company. And they had an A&R man called John Barry, who was a hugely important figure because he became a great film score writer and arranger. But in those days, he had something called the John Barry Seven, and he wrote themes. He wrote the theme for Jukebox Jury, which was one of the most popular television programs playing contemporary popular music. And so he was an important character, and he was their A&R man and their first producer. And I went along and photographed the first recording session, and got picked up by Ember Records. The work I did, and got the first album cover with Ember Records. And so in '63, I suddenly found myself in the music business without really planning it, just sort of falling into it because of this connection to Chad and Jeremy.
Yes, my God, that's amazing. Then, was it '64 that you had got introduced to the Stones at this point? And you weren't even 20, were you, at this point?
No, I was 18.
18, which is still quite extraordinary to think, you know, when you're 18, we know it all, don't we? But when you meet an 18-year-old now, you think...
Well, I know, it's a funny thing. 18, I know, it clearly was very young. However, I was already sort of establishing myself. I'd worked with Marianne Faithfull, and it was through my work with Marianne Faithfull that her manager, who I'd never met, called Andrew Loog Oldham, who also managed and produced the Rolling Stones, he liked some pictures I did of Marianne, and I got an invitation to go up to the office to meet him and the band, which is what I did, and that was late '64.
Yes. And then, so how did you, because, you know, I'm sort of veering towards this amazing book that came out, and this is kind of coming towards that point, isn't it? So then, how did you get the invite to suddenly hang out with them and go on tour and go to America?
Well, I did my first session with them in '65, and I think that when I went to their office to meet them, I think it was a sort of, not exactly a trial or an audition, but it was just to see if we clicked. And they were very nice and they were very welcoming. And the next thing I knew, I was shooting a session in my studio with them. And out of that session came an album cover for an album of theirs called Out of Our Heads, as well as a lot of other material. And I think Andrew Oldham just felt that my naivety and my lack of experience gave the pictures a sort of naturalistic edge that the Stones needed, or he felt the Stones needed at that time, to perhaps get away from the slightly more showbizy image of the Beatles and other bands. And it clicked, it worked clearly, because he got an album cover out of it, he got lots of other material out of it. And the band were very happy with working with me. They seemed to like me. And I got on very well with all of them, and it just clicked, you know, it just worked.
Yes.
And then later that year, '65, I got a call saying, would I like to go on tour with them to America in the autumn of that year. And that's what we did, yeah.
And was that was that their first tour of America at this stage?
No, it was actually their fourth tour and their second of 65. But it was the first tour after Satisfaction had become a global hit. And so the 65 is a momentous year for the Rolling Stones and for me, because at the beginning of the year, when they first came to my studio, they were extremely well known. They'd had some hits, but they hadn't had that extraordinary global success, the success that was going to make them huge everywhere. And Satisfaction was the single that did that. And then this tour that I did, which was October, November, and early December of 65, was a consolidating tour because they'd had Satisfaction, and Get Off My Cloud, which was the follow-up, had just been released and was being guided up the charts as they toured and became number one about sort of halfway through the tour.
Right.
So they were the number one band in America at that moment.
Yes, you do capture a certain zeitgeist, because the photographs at the beginning of the book are beautiful, but mostly around the building site, probably in London somewhere, and them sort of posing and just kind of wandering around looking moody but slightly innocent at the same time, which were quite stunning. What was that like, sort of hanging around with a group of 5 other musicians and trying to direct them? Because you, obviously with age, one gets a little bit more experience dealing with people. How did you direct those kind of sessions?
Well, I somehow instinctively understood that you don't tell people how to pose. You try and guide them into a shape that is compositionally appealing, and you sort of get them to try to do it naturally, as naturally as possible. But they were very responsive. They were very easy to work with. There wasn't any real resistance. I mean, it was a band that somehow understood the importance of photography and image and listened to Andrew, I think, who was very, very sharp and on the ball in terms of vision for the band. And it didn't seem to me at the time to be very difficult. I knew that first session was really important for me, but I didn't feel at all intimidated by the band. And I just felt very comfortable with them. And by the time I went to America with them, and the latter part of that year, I just felt like I was one of the band.
Right.
I mean, it might sound ridiculous, but I really did. And there was no separation between me and the band during that tour. I mean, everything, there wasn't their area and my area. We were all as one. And there was only the band and me and Ian Stewart, the road manager. I mean, there were 2 or 3 peripheral agents, and there was a great character called Ronnie Schneider, who was the money man on the tour and was my roommate for quite a lot of the tour. But it was we were all together, and we were a gang, and I felt like part of the gang,
Yes, well, it's been brilliant, I suppose it happens with a lot of people, but obviously at the moment there's lots of people getting their archives and sorting through them, and probably realise that, I don't know, 10 years, 20 years after the event, there was a little bit of interest, but 40, 50 years, suddenly there is this phenomenal amount of interest and fascination just seeing the most probably ordinary, mundane pictures, but they take on another quality and another vibe, because you had obviously the pictures of them in London around the building site, but then just pictures of them on the plane, playing cards, backstage, playing with a basketball, and then, seeing various members on horses going in, this is all in America, these latter ones. They're just so evocative, aren't they? And that must have been so nice to see them just, on a plane, which, let's face it, probably at the time didn't seem that special, but obviously now we think, wow, that's incredible. Look at that, smoking on a plane.
Yeah. It felt special. I mean, going to America for the first time was special, and to do it with that band was special, and to go first class on TWA, which was the the sort of trendy airline of the moment. That was special. It felt pretty special, but I felt very at ease and very comfortable with it. And the thing is that the photographs, they are very evocative, and they do also, in spite of being very dated because of how young the band look, they have a sort of timeless quality to them as well. And I think that putting them together in this book, and I was resistant to doing this book initially because I've done other books of my Stones photographs, and this publisher came along to us and said, he'd really love to do a book with me on the Stones, but he'd like to publish, he'd like unpublished pictures. And I thought, well, I'm not sure whether there are any. And he urged me to revisit my archive. And I was resistant to it, but I did it. And within a few hours, I thought, oh, wow, stuff here that I just missed. And, the thing is that my archive on the Stones is pretty big. I'm not sure. I've never counted every individual frame, but it's somewhere around about 5,000-6,000 negatives. And, you only ever have the opportunity to show or publish a handful of these pictures. And once you've made that selection, it's those pictures that tend to come up again and again because they're accessible, because people have seen them and want to see them again and blah, blah, blah. So when I started delving into it, and I realized that there were an awful lot of pictures that I'd missed, not because they weren't any good, but because there was one that at that earlier moment shone through, and that was plucked out, and the rest of the film was just pushed to one side. So it's an amazing opportunity to have been able to revisit the work and pull together, I'm not sure, nearly 300 photographs. And
yes,
it's never been published before.
Amazing, because again, it goes through those stages that I mentioned of them in different locations, and then obviously being on stage and seeing the excitement and the adrenaline of the audience as well. Did you have to sort of not raise your game, but was it quite a different experience suddenly having to try and find places to be on stage or around the stage to try and capture them? Was that a kind of a first for you, having to be kind of in a live setting?
It wasn't an absolute first, because actually I'd gone on the road in '64 with the John Barry 7, which was a very, very different. It was in the Midlands. It was staying in some pretty hellish B&Bs and traveling in clapped out vans and cars. But it was an adventure, and it was something that I'm pleased I did. This was the first tour as such, and it was the first. Let me just quickly say, stage performance in those days was very unsophisticated. I mean, it really was. And in America, although they were playing some quite big arenas, the lighting was more often than not absolutely appalling. And God knows what the sound must have been like. I mean, I was on stage with the band most of the time, so what I heard was very different to what the audience was hearing, I think.
Yes.
But the audience was screaming so much and jumping up and down so much that I don't think they really minded what they heard. But working in that environment was not wildly rewarding photographically. It was a challenge because the lighting was so bad, as I said. Sometimes I couldn't get an exposure. I mean, it was just too dark. But what I felt I could perhaps try and do was to capture the atmosphere of the feeling of being on stage with the Stones, the feeling of being in the spotlight. That vibe is what I wanted to try and get. And I think I think looking back, I think I caught that quite well. but at the time, I didn't really feel as though I'd been very successful. I'd felt that, in a way, photographically, the whole thing was a bit of a disaster.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is tricky, isn't it? But I mean, what also makes it is a lot of the crowd pictures or backstage or just those, probably at the time, you looked and went, why did I take this picture? This is so boring. But now we look at it and it's something incredible about those backstage shots. A bit like when you see, photographs of of streets from towns, cities, even villages. I mean, at the time you'd have thought, oh my God, what a waste, especially when you used to sort of pay quite a lot of money to
I don't,
kind of,
I, I don't think I don't think I wouldn't have taken them if I thought that they were boring. I think I took them because I thought that I was capturing what was happening at that moment. I didn't think that the pictures were boring or dull. I just thought that this was what was going on in front of me, and I was trying to record it in a photojournalistic style, and trying to capture what it was like to be on the road with the Stones in 1965. I don't think I felt, why did I do this? I think that I just felt I was trying to put together a picture story about the Stones on the road. That's what I was
yes.
trying to do.
I understand. Yes, I can see that. There was just a little section where you've got those ones where they play Fort Worth in Texas and they're sort of
Yeah.
bundling in and out of a van. And I mean, I think they look amazing now. And perhaps they looked amazing then, but at the same time, I just wondered if you thought, yeah, that's not going to pay the rent, is it, that one?
Well, I know the series of pictures. You see, I love those pictures because I think that they capture something that is, ridiculous now. The idea that you would bring in the number one band in America in a sort of Brinks armored truck because they were playing in the round, they were playing in the center of the auditorium. And some bright spark suddenly realized that they couldn't walk the Rolling Stones through an audience of thousands of screaming teenage girls. And so they put them in this truck and then reversed it through and it felt like, at the time, to be honest, it felt like an extraordinary thing that was happening. And I was just trying to record it, but one was buffeted by everything that was going on. It was chaotic. And I've tried to capture that. And there's one shot in the book of this van reversing up, and you can see the Fort Worth sign and the clock above the van. And there's a young girl on the right-hand side of the frame, and she looks lovely, but somehow the juxtaposition of what's going on and this girl, I think it's a really, really lovely photograph. So, yeah, I definitely didn't feel that I was taking boring or dull pictures. It wasn't particularly rewarding as a photographic experience for me.
No, but yes, I can see the picture you're talking about with that sign. Howdy, folks. Welcome to Forth. There you go. Beautifully captured there. I know it's bonkers, really, isn't it? But then within this amazing book and your sort of year and a bit with the Stones, you not only do the tour, but they then are recording their next album, aren't they? So you go from LA to Hollywood, and that's where they start recording their new material. So they're pretty industrious. Were you around you were at the, but when they were looking at what they were writing and how they were going to try and record their next material, did you get a little bit of an insight with that experience?
Not so much. I'm not so much on the actual creative process, but we knew that they were under quite a lot of pressure because obviously they knew they were going into the studio. They had to come up with whatever it was, 12 new songs. And there was a lot of pressure on them. But Mick and Keith, if I remember rightly, tended to just sort of go into Mick's room or Keith's room and get on with it. What was exciting was to be in the recording studio with them and to see the way the songs evolved and developed and suddenly, almost as if by magic, materialize as a piece of music that you can recognize. And I always was fascinated by that. Not being a musician myself, not able to play at all, I always found that sort of magical quality element incredibly exciting.
Yes, it is. It's quite extraordinary. And had you started seeing dynamics within the band develop at that stage, or was it still quite new and it was all still in the honeymoon phase of
I
like?
wouldn't call it. I wouldn't call it a honeymoon phase because I think the honeymoon was over. Perhaps when Mick and Keith started writing their own material, I think that brought about an enormous change on every possible level. But Brian was in pretty good shape still, and because that's what you're referring to, the dynamic of Brian and the band. And Brian
Yes.
he was still in pretty good shape. I mean, he was. It was quite clear that he wasn't entirely stable, and he could go off and he could be quite odd, and he could even disappear for 48 hours. But he was still an very important, major contributor to the band, and in the recording studio was seemed to be in great form. I mean, I was only there for the first 2 or 3 days of the recording, and then I went back to the UK. But in those first 2 or 3 days, and the album they were making, by the way, was going to be Aftermath, the album that was released in early '66. And Brian was in pretty good shape, and there wasn't really much evidence of particular tension between everybody. They were still working as a pretty tight unit.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? But bizarrely, because then the next part of the book is the 66, the Stones at Home, and it's weird because I was thinking when I was looking at those photographs, the following year is the Summer of Love, where it's full on psychedelia for the main players, and that's where you started getting Jefferson Airplane and Hendrix and the Doors appearing, and the Stones had really started to change themselves. But the photographs capture still a very kind of dandy, modish, clean cut group of people sort of in domestic settings, and Mick with a lovely picture of a cat and them being very excited with cars and yes, gardens and horses. It's quite weird, isn't it, how 1 year, 2 years have got such a massive impact.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's quite extraordinary when if you look at Keith at the beginning of '65 in my first session with them, and then Keith in the recording studio at the end of '65, the difference is extraordinary. The change is extraordinary. So things were changing very rapidly. I mean, they had, and I don't have all of this information directly available, but they had 2 massive global hits in '65, and that changed everything. That shifted everything. And by '66, the money was beginning to come through, and there was interest in their domestic situation. I mean, they were celebrities, and there was enough media interest to justify doing a set of photographs of them each at home. And they were generally taking the piss out of the at-home genre. I mean, it wasn't something that they, they were sort of being Rolling Stonesy and piss-taking about it. And having a laugh, really, and but they do give you this sort of extraordinary insight to this sort of, as you put it, as you mentioned, sort of domestic bliss, and their individual styles are quite clear and apparent, and they're lovely, evocative photographs, I think.
Yes, well, they are, and they all look very sort of clean cut and quite wholesome and playing along. But Brian does, and those photographs, Brian does appear quite differently, though, doesn't he? His eyes are looking a bit more sunken, and he looks a little bit more. Yes, I don't know. I did an interview with a character. I don't know if you ever came across him during this period, called Prince Stash. He refers to himself.
Yeah, I knew him well. Yeah.
And yes, I did an interview. It must have been earlier this year, I think. And he often talks about Brian and various Anita Pallenberg. Yeah. So yes, was he around that scene during that period, or was that a little bit later?
I can't remember. I mean, I remember Stash well. He was very nice. He was very charming and very sophisticated, very clever, very bright. He was a very nice man. He and I got on rather well, and he was around that Keith, Brian, Anita, Marianne sort of world, and very close to Brian. He certainly wasn't at Brian's flat when I photographed him. Brian was, I think Brian was always a little bit ahead of everybody when it came to psychedelics, and that showed in this sort of crazy bohemian artist's pad that he had in Courtfield Road, South Kensington. And I think he decided to take the photographs rather more seriously than, for instance, Mick had done. And he set himself up to be very much the sort of artist at home, surrounded by books and records and instruments and beautiful fabrics. And this was the artist, in the privacy of his own home. But he was a bohemian. He was a free spirit. He was painted on his walls. He dressed in satin and silks. He was quite extraordinary and flamboyant, whereas in a way the others didn't have a trace of flamboyance. Maybe Mick a little bit, but Keith, at home in Sussex at his beautiful country house, is just in a white shirt. He's not, it's not a fashion shoot. He's not on stage. He's just at home and very laid back.
Yes, with his tomatoes and
his tomatoes, yeah.
But one thing I do love about the book, and there's lots of things which are stunning, is these fantastic chapters that you've also added in there. And actually, 3 of the people I've managed to do interviews with, including Terry Newman, who did a book on Taylor Swift style. Yeah. So whose idea was it to sort of complement the photos with some nice essays?
Well, a couple of years ago, a little bit longer actually, 4 years ago, I was working on another book with the same publisher. And it was a book that never got published, but we had the idea of inviting several good writers to write about different aspects of that particular artist. And when we came to the Stones book, I said, why don't we do the same for this book? And that's how it had come out, because we'd approached Will Hodgkinson, Terry Newman, Dr. Leah
Vardos.
Yeah, Vardos, for the previous book, and they had written beautiful essays. And unfortunately, as I say, that never got published. So it felt natural for me. And I wanted, it seemed, I'm not a writer. I mean, I can do captions, I can do paragraphs, I can perhaps paint a bit of a picture, but I can't write objective, good prose. And I wanted to have that in the book. And so we got these 5 really talented people to write about different aspects of the Stones from a different point of view. And I think it's given the book a great deal more depth and substance, and makes it much more than just, another picture book. Yes,
no, I think it's brilliant. I love those pieces. And Will, was it Leia and Terry Newman? I know you also got Peter York, who was Mr. 80s, really, let's face it. So they're nice little pieces. So then the book kind of finishes, is it 60? Well, you're
67.
67 at, is it Olympia Studios?
Olympic Studios in London, which is where they recorded where they always recorded when they were in London. Yeah.
Yes. And then with that, as just briefly, it's an amazing book. But then how does your career navigate the 60s? Because one thing I've noticed with quite a few photographers, and actually the same with musicians, is there's often kind of a very good zeitgeist period and then sometimes a little bit strugglish, but you embrace the 70s as well. But before we get to the 70s, how do you then get through the rest of the 60s? Because obviously clean cut stone 65s, 66, and then all hell breaks out for the rest of that decade, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, I had a very good 60s up until quite late 69. I had a good 60s. I worked with some great people. I had some marvelous. I worked a lot with Island Records, for instance. I worked with Andrew at Immediate Records. So I was very settled. I worked with Hendrix in 1967, and I worked continuously until about September, October 1969, when I lost my studio. I had to give up my Mason's Yard studio because they put up the rent and we couldn't afford to stay. And Immediate Records went bankrupt, closed down. And those two things really threw me. And I imagined that perhaps I should move on from the music business, that I was perhaps already too old for the music business. And then I started working with Slade, who were then called Ambrose Slade.
Oh, yes.
For Chas Chandler, because I'd worked with Chas a lot, and he was the guy who found Jimi Hendrix in New York, and he asked me to work with Slade. And then the transition, the slightly uneasy transition from 69 to 70, it was Chas and Slade that really held me down kept me into the music business, because I was flying off trying to work on movies and other things, and trying to find different channels for my photography. But Chas Chandler and Slade really sort of kept me back in the music business. And then, although the 70s got off to quite a difficult start, I settled down in a studio in Great Windmill Street in Soho with some very good old friends of mine. And I almost immediately started working with Mickey Most at Rack Records and Susie Quattro and Chinny Chap, and embraced the whole 70s thing, the glam rock and that sort of bubble pop and all of the stuff that was happening in the 70s. And I had a great 70s. I mean, I really did. I really enjoyed it. And the decade sort of ended really, with Kate Bush, which was huge. So that was 78 into 79. And then the Tourists and Eurythmics, and I was into the 80s.
Yes. Just just going slightly back, the Hendrix picture, which is one of his most iconic photos of all time. I mean, and you took it. So what was it Chas who set you up for that, to take a photograph? Thankfully of him and not the other two.
Well, I did all of them in the session. But I mean, it was quite obvious that to do the band, but also to do Jimmy by himself. I mean, that was a given. I can't remember. Chas wasn't there. Nobody was there. It was just me and the band. I didn't even have an assistant in those days. So it was just the four of us. And their roadie had dropped them off outside the studio and was going to pick them up at about 4:30 to drive them down to a gig on the South Coast, on Hastings Pier, I think, if I remember correctly. Yes. And so, I was photographing Jimmy by himself and with the experience, and that particular picture of Jimmy, which has sort of become a great classic image, was one of many I did of solo Jimmy that day.
Yes, amazing. I'm guessing he was just an easy, delightful guy. But where did he get the coat from? Had he already develop that style? Because it's this amazing.
Oh, yeah, no, that was him. That was completely him. I mean, there was no, in those days, we didn't have stylists or makeup people, or we didn't have anybody contributing. It was just, it was just the band and the photographer. That's what it was. I mean, there was no art direction. Chas Chandler never even bothered to come to the studio. I mean, he would be in his office and I would deliver the pictures the next day. So there was no styling. What you see is Jimmy, and he'd got the jacket either earlier that year or the end of '66, I really don't know, from this place called Lord Kitchener's Valet.
Oh, yes.
And Lord Kitchener's Valet sold old army uniforms. I mean, they were all genuine ex-army uniforms. And other things, police cloaks and naval outfits, and I mean everything. Particularly popular were the big naval, that blue serge overcoats were hugely popular. So Jimmy just took to that look, that whole style, like a duck to water. It was as though it was all made for him.
Yes, my God, it must be just one of those pictures you just think, I don't know, if at the time it was just like, oh yes, that's what you do, but now you just think, that's extraordinary. That was your photo.
Yeah, well, it is. It is extraordinary. And those pictures, that session has a life all of its own now. I mean, that picture is, it's all over the world, and it's collected avidly by hundreds of collectors everywhere. And it's a picture I'm immensely proud of. But I have to say that what Jimmy did for me that day was quite extraordinary, because what he allowed me in for that fraction of a second, when you capture something about a person that is absolutely entirely authentic, and you can only do that if the subject allows you in, and he did. He was sweet, kind, humble, nice man, very funny. Gosh, we were laughing so much.
Yes.
I'm forever grateful to him for being such a wonderful subject.
Yes, and the other, artist that I adore is Kate Bush. And obviously, you've got some amazing photographs of her in her very early years, incredibly early years, really. So, how did she get on your radar? Because obviously, I don't know, she was probably only 17, 18 at the time, and barely doing Wuthering Heights, I guess, and the Kick Inside album.
Well, EMI Records, who were a regular client of mine, called me in because they had this wonderful artist called Kate Bush, but they didn't have an image for her. They'd done an album cover for The Kick Inside, which was an idea of Kate's and her brother's, which they art directed, working with a very skilled and accomplished commercial photographer. But it was awful. I mean, in itself, it's probably quite a nice image, but it didn't work as a cover, and it didn't give EMI an image to sell Kate with. And that's what they needed, and that's what they asked me to produce, to come up with. And they showed me the video of Wuthering Heights.
Yes.
And it was quite clear from that, and listening to the record 2 or 3 times in quick succession, it was quite clear that movement and dance was absolutely key and crucial to her. And so I went away and I came up with the idea of putting her in leotards and dancers' practice clothes. And I went back to EMI, met Kate, who was absolutely lovely, put the idea to them, and everybody thought it was great. And that was it. The rest is history.
Yes.
I did, I think, 3 or 4 other sessions with her that year. And basically every official photograph for that first year, for the only tour, and into 79 were mine. And then I did Lionheart. I did the cover for Lionheart as well.
God, that must be so pleasing when a person that could have gone either way just ended up being someone of that caliber, basically. Because you really, I mean, because you mentioned the 70s, that you do manage to capture the main kind of top 10 players really at this time, the kind of the glam artists. So that must have been quite interesting, because quite a lot of those artists were much older than, you know, like teen hits of kind of now, possibly. You know, they're quite oldish chaps who have been around, and probably a few, I don't know how old Susie Quattro was, but what was it like photographing them? Because obviously part of it is quite interesting, part of it is quite ridiculous, isn't it? Like, you know,
Well, you mean like Sweet or...
Oh, yes, I know. Yes, how did you gather? Oh, Alvin Stardust. Is it Alvin Stardust? And
well, I suppose the thing is that the theatricality of it all. I mean, I love, you know, I go back to my love of theatre and my love of film early on, and I like performance. I mean, if you go on, when you go on the road with a band, you're conscious of the performance of, you know, it's a good night, a bad night, that everybody's very tight, you know, it's a really good show. It's a show, you know, they're putting on a show.
yes,
And you Alvin Stardust and Gary Glitter, who we really can't mention, I suppose, but, you know, and all the others, Sweet, Mud, Susie, you know, all those Chinny Chap artists and all that rack music stuff. They were putting on a show, and by that time, you see, I was pretty experienced. I mean, I'd been a working photographer for over 10 years, and I was, you know, I knew my stuff, and so I was evolving as a photographer, and there was a certain challenge, I think, in photographing, taking Slade or Sweet or Susie and helping develop an image evolve. And I really loved working with them. I found Sweet were a bit of a struggle. But we got some great pictures, but I mean, often slightly sort of taking the piss out of themselves. And, you know, Susie was wonderful and remains a great friend still. And she was fantastic. And that whole leader of the pack
yes,
thing that we developed in the studio, and we did it, I don't know, 6 or 7 times in different forms and shapes. I love that challenge. You know, I get a call, we need another session with Susie, and I try and come up with another way of presenting her and the band with a similar flavor, but somehow evolved and perhaps a little bit more sophisticated technically. And it was a great period for me. I think I really developed as a photographer through that period, and I didn't struggle with the music particularly. I enjoy pop music. I've always liked pop music, and there was some fantastic pop music in the 70s. I mean, it was...
my God, yes. I mean, it was. I mean, well, getting Slade. I mean, they were up there with. Yes, they were just chart-topping bands, really, weren't they? I mean, then, but just briefly, then you do slip into punk as well, which is often another.
Yeah.
Can be tricky for people, because even though we listen to it now, and it doesn't seem very radical at the time, it is or was, and you know, some of the characters all look a bit edgy but very much younger. How did you get on with people like Billy Idol and Generation X and the Jam as well, Paul Weller, who's
Yeah, I think that the when punk emerged, with the Pistols and other bands around them, I assumed that was it for me. I thought that was it. I was finished. I went to a concert at the Roundhouse in Camden in London to see the Adverts and the Damned and a couple of other bands. And I walked around the Roundhouse And I was sort of overwhelmed by what I was seeing. And I really loved the energy of it and the rebelliousness of it and the sort of uncouth nature of it. But I couldn't relate to it at all. And I thought, well, they don't want me. I mean, why? They don't want some old fart music photographer. They want some punk kid photographer. So I thought that was it. That was over. But like a lot of things, the energy of punk, the authentic rebelliousness of punk was sort of homogenized by the record companies quite rapidly.
Mm.
And suddenly, over a year perhaps, there were artists whose roots might have been in punk, but they actually wanted a more theatrical presentation. And Billy Idol and Generation X were one of them. And they came to my studio, and in fact, I did, I think, 3 sessions with them all together. But I did their first album, Gen X, and they wanted a stylized, smouldering band portrait that had I put them in at strange angles, and I did some quite odd things photographically to try and maintain a sort of punk ethos, if you like. But they wanted a polish, they wanted it to be honed. And so suddenly, unexpectedly, I was being brought in to work with these bands. And it was terrific. And I mean, I got on very well with all of them. The Jam was slightly more standoffish, but we got a fantastic session and a great cover.
Yes, well, absolutely. The very iconic cover of them under
who else? Doctors of Madness. Great.
And also, you went and did magazine.
Yeah, well, they're crawling down a sort of. Yes, one of the difficult moments in my life. Yeah. Howard Devoto walked out of that set.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, magazine. Yeah, he walked out of that session. He stormed out, actually. And I don't quite know why, because I spent quite a lot of time with him at Virgin Records talking ideas through, and I thought that I was following up the ideas, and I loved what I was doing with them. Again, I thought it was a portrait that was sort of quite slightly disturbing, which I thought was appropriate. And he did the one setup, and then he basically stormed out. And it was unpleasant for everybody, actually. But we did get, I did get a great photograph, which I'm terribly proud of, and I think captures a sort of unsettling aspect of his work at the time.
Yes. And a few years ago, or last year, I was listening to David Dalton, who was a writer, talking about his life. He'd worked on the Rolling Stone, but initially he was a photographer for a very short period of time and had a young Linda Eastman who sort of came up to him and said, can I become your assistant? And he thought, oh, that's nice. This is the early 60s. And she obviously becomes a photographer and he then becomes a writer. But you do you do photograph wings with Linda and Paul and the band. What was that like doing that session? Because obviously, again, massive characters.
Well, I knew Paul a bit. I knew him in the 60s, although I never worked with the Beatles. I knew Paul socially. We always got on very well. I always liked him very much, and he always seemed very friendly. I photographed him at a recording session, a sort of random Marianne Faithfull session he was at. And so I knew him, and I got called in to shoot material for the ill-fated Wings Over Japan tour program. And he had rented a theatre in, I think it's Eastbourne or Bournemouth, I can't remember exactly. Eastbourne, I think. And I went down there for the day while they were rehearsing and did a really lovely session. I thought I was very pleased with it, and he was great. I mean, and Linda was sweet. She came. I'd never met her before, and as a photographer, she understood that there might have been some tension for me, and she was so sweet. She completely diffused any problems that I might have had working with her, and she was great. She was very, very nice, and she just let me do whatever it was that I was trying to do.
Yes.
And it was great. And I was very pleased with the session. But then, of course, the program was never seen because the tour was cancelled. Paul was busted, and thousands and thousands of copies of my pictures were burnt. So that was that.
Oh, so disappointing. So then you mentioned, by the 80s, had you kind of thought, right, there's nothing in the music world for me anymore, and did you sort of then become a commercial photographer?
Well, it wasn't quite as cut and dried as that. I'd sensed that I was going to have to. It was punk, really. Punk had moved me to a point where I thought I'm going to have another string to my bow. I didn't want to get out of music. I loved working in music. I really enjoyed it. I love working with musicians, and I still do. But I felt that I had to find another string to my bow. I can't think of another way of putting it. And so I was aiming to try and move into commercial photography, but not away from music. I was going to try and run them concurrently as parallel careers, if you like, because I had a big studio. By this time, by 79, I'd moved into what was to be my final studio, a studio I stayed in for over 20 years, a beautiful Victorian chapel in Hampstead. And it was a big space. I could build big sets. I could do elaborate things like the tourists cover and interesting things and all the stuff with Kate. But at the same time, I thought, well, music isn't going to last forever, and so I'll develop a commercial career, which is what I did. But I always dabbled.
Yes.
I always stayed in the music business, partly because I still had friends who were performers who wanted me to work with them, like Dana Gillespie, who I've worked with continuously for heavens, nearly 60 years. P.P. Arnold, who I've worked with continuously since 1967. So there's people I've continued to work with, but I needed to find another way of expressing myself and also earning some real money, because I never made very much money as a music photographer, and that really had to change. I had a family to support, and I needed to develop as a commercial photographer in order to keep going, really.
Yes, get serious. And if you were to whisper something to your 16-year-old self starting out, is there anything in particular you would have said, oh yes, that would have been a good idea to have focused on or thought about, or a direction?
Oh, I find that's a really good question, but I'm not quite sure how to answer it because in a way, the 16-year-old, 17-year-old Gered was doing instinctively something right. I mean, doors opened and I stepped through and another door opened for me, and they wouldn't have opened if I hadn't been doing something right.
Yes.
And
Well,
I think that I don't want to listen. I don't want to come across as being arrogant or pompous, but I don't know what I'd say to myself different, really. Maybe I would say, if you ever get a chance to photograph a genius like Jimi Hendrix, make sure you shoot a few rolls of color and not just black and white.
Indeed, very wise words there. And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Gered for giving me the time for that. I will put his website in the notes below. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 Show, and all these interviews have been archived. Aren't you lucky? You can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.